Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about some terrain. We're going to be talking about terrain features, how to use them, and how your armies can benefit from using them, and what they mean. Because it seems like there is a lot of maybe confusion, or or folks are unclear on how terrain works. First and foremost, the thing to understand about terrain is what terrain traits a terrain piece has and how those interact in the game. So typically, we have various types of terrain that we use in our meta here. I've loaded up a map in Tabletop Simulator that can maybe replicate most of what we use, and how it functions. So the first thing that we really need to talk about is the different types of terrain. What different types of terrain are available, what different types of terrain there are in the game. So there's several different terrain categories in the game. And the first one is our hills, which we don't really use a lot of. And typically, hills are not really considered a terrain feature. They're just considered part of the battlefield. And as such, generally speaking, hills don't really have any kind of terrain keywords. The next type we'll talk about are obstacles. And obstacles, they can be any type of different thing, like a barricade or a ruined wall or something like that, and even like containers, really, like these containers right here. These armored containers would be considered obstacles, and we use a lot of these types of terrain pieces in our games, and I'm going to talk about those and how they interact as well, along with some of the other pieces that we have here. But the other type is area terrain, and area terrain really ranges from all kinds of different categories, from ruins to woods and craters and things like that. Which again are things that we commonly use in our games. And the most common terrain feature that you're going to find when you play is going to be area terrain of some type. Generally speaking, there'll be ruins, but sometimes there'll be forests and craters and stuff like that as well. The other and final type are buildings, and buildings are kind of different. Generally speaking, buildings, an actual building is usually something that has a fortification battlefield role. It's actually something that you're going to bring in your list most of the time. I know, for example, that we tend to use like the solid boxes in our meta, like those solid boxes that we have on the tables there. Those are actually, while they are technically, they look like buildings, we classify those as area terrain, and we'll go over those too. So within those different terrain categories, the different terrain categories have different features, and many of them are kind of common amongst different terrain pieces. If you look in our league document, you'll find that we have those kind of terrain categories broke down with what kind of traits that they have. And typically, when we talk about ruins and stuff like that, or area terrain pieces, if they're larger than 5 inches, then they'll have obscuring, as well as light cover, and things like that. So let's take a look at how some of this terrain interacts and what it means and what the difference is. And we're particularly going to be touching base on things like obscuring. and how that functions and why it's important to note how that terrain works in the game, so that you have an understanding of how to best utilize it. Because in a lot of cases, obscuring is one of the better terrain traits in the game, obviously, and it's pretty beneficial. But we have to really understand how to use obscuring terrain. So we're going to start off and just talk about the obscuring rule first, okay? And it's important to note how the terrain functions along with the core rules in the game, okay? So I'm going to pull up the app here just on my phone, and I'm going to read. We're going to read the obscuring benefit, okay? The obscuring terrain trait says, if this terrain feature is at least 5 inches in height, then models cannot see through or over this terrain feature. This means that one model is not visible to another, and this is the key thing. This means that one model is not visible to another if you cannot draw a straight line 1 millimeter in thickness between them without it passing through or over any part of this terrain feature. The height of a terrain feature is measured from the highest point on that terrain feature. Models that are on or within terrain features, or on or within the terrain feature, can see and can be seen and targeted normally. Aircraft models and models with a wounds characteristic of 18 or more are visible and can be targeted even if this terrain feature is in between it and the firing model. But the reverse is not true. Now, what that means is that models with the aircraft special rule, models that like Magnus the Red or Imperial Knights, models that have 18 or more wounds, they can't benefit from obscuring terrain. But they also are restricted by it. Okay, and I'm going to throw some examples up here for you. Okay, so I'm going to put down some units and give you an example or an idea of how some of this terrain works. Okay, so we're going to start with, let's see, which terrain feature do we want to play with first? I think we'll play with this one. Okay, and we'll talk about some of the different terrain features as well. But right here we have a ruin, and it has some area terrain features that are pretty much common to what we use in our own terrain. It has scalable, breachable, light cover, defensible, and obscuring. And we're going to talk about this and how this interacts. Okay, so I'm going to grab some models here, okay, to give you kind of an example of how this actually functions in the game. So we've got here a squad of Marines with multi-meltas. We're going to place them over here, just behind this wall here. Okay. All right. So the important thing too about these terrain features is that you have to identify what the footprint is, and typically the footprint we identify with our terrain is going to be like corner from one corner to the other corner if it doesn't have a base, right? And this particular feature here has a base. Okay, so all of this is part of the terrain's footprint. And what that means is that while you're in the footprint of it, you benefit from the terrain feature. And where that comes into play in obscuring is if you're not touching this terrain feature, i.e. you don't have models on the base here, you don't have models on the rooftop, or excuse me, on the next level here, then this unit here is potentially obscured from targets. Okay, so let's bring out Magnus the Red. There he is. Now Magnus the Red is a demon Primarch that has more than 18 wounds, which means that he cannot benefit from obscuring terrain, which means that he can be seen and targeted normally. All right. So we have a squad of tactical marines here, right? And we have a ruin here that's obscuring, but it also has windows. Okay, and what that means is that while they're behind the terrain feature here and they're not in it, they are benefiting from being obscured, but they are also restricted in what they can see, right? So normally they would not be able to shoot out of these windows against most units, but because Magnus has 18 or more wounds, they can see him as long as they can actually draw true line of sight and draw visibility to him. So we can see here that they can actually see Magnus through the window. So what that means is that they do not have to actually move onto this terrain feature to shoot Magnus. Okay? They can see him, they can see part of his model through the windows, and they can target him normally. Conversely, Magnus cannot target them in his current position, okay, because we look at his wingtip and his entire body and his weapons, and there's no part of that model that can go through to the Marines over here without passing through this terrain feature. What that means is that because these units are not on the terrain feature, they cannot be targeted by Magnus in this instance, because the line of sight from any angle is passing through that terrain feature, so they are obscured. So because he has 18 or more wounds, they can see him, but he cannot see them. Now, let's say that we decide we want to actually put these guys in the terrain feature. Okay, so we put them in the terrain feature. Okay, so they're in here now. All right. Now, because they're in the terrain feature, they can shoot through the windows at any target, and it doesn't count as going through obscuring terrain for them. Okay, but they can also now be seen as long as true line of sight can be drawn to them. So we go back now to Magnus, and Magnus can see them through the windows. And while the line of sight does go through the obscuring terrain, because they are on the obscuring terrain, or within the obscuring terrain, and even just one model from the unit, then this unit can be targeted now by Magnus because they're in there. He can see them through the windows. Line of sight can be drawn from any part of the model to the next through the windows, and Magnus can now target this unit. Okay, so let's look at a different example. Okay, because that's a pretty easy one, right? Let's look at a bit of a different example here. Okay, we're gonna take Magnus out of the picture here. Okay, I'm just gonna slide him over to the side for now. Okay, now let's look at a Hive Tyrant. Okay, we're gonna reposition this a little bit. Okay. Now, Hive Tyrant is a model that has less than 18 wounds and doesn't meet the criteria for being seen all the time. Okay, so we're going to do a couple of things here to show you how this works. All right, first thing that we're going to do is we're just going to turn him a little bit. We're going to put him back where Magnus was. Okay, so he's back here where Magnus was. All right. And we're going to pull these guys. We've already pulled them back off of it. And the same here applies, right? They can't see him, even though they can see him through the windows. They're outside of the terrain feature, and their line of sight, the way you look at it, passes through the terrain feature, right? Passes through the terrain feature. So the Hive Tyrant cannot be targeted by this squad, and conversely, the Hive Tyrant also cannot target them, because he cannot draw line of sight either, similar to the same way Magnus was. But let's change something up a little bit, because this is where this sort of thing gets into play and gets confusing, and why I said there's a distinct difference in how you measure to line of sight versus how you measure to shoot something and measure range and stuff. All right, so let's say this Hive Tyrant is right here. Okay, let's say this Hive Tyrant is right here, and let's say these Marines are like right here. Okay, let's say they're like right about here or so. Now, when we look at this, we see that the Hive Tyrant is, his base is on the other side of this obscuring terrain piece, right? But that really doesn't matter. Because we're talking about drawing line of sight, and we need line of sight drawn to the model, a part of the model. All right, so let's see. We got these wings here sticking out. You can see these wings here sticking out, right? So because of that, because let's see, this guy, for example, here, okay, he can see, he can draw line of sight to the wingtip, and this is not accurate necessarily because it's trying to center me on the center point when I use the tool. But you're measuring basically from like any part of his model, like say his gun here, right? His gun, we'll do it from like, say right about, we won't hit right on the model, right there, right? His gun can draw line of sight without crossing over that footprint of this terrain piece, and can see the wing. And that means that this Hive Tyrant is visible and not benefiting from obscuring, and can be seen and shot normally by all the models that can actually draw that type of line of sight, like this guy. Okay? Right? All of these guys that can see the wingtip without passing through the terrain feature can now shoot it, that Hive Tyrant. So that's an important distinction, right? That's important, because that explains to us why, how, although normally you would measure the distance between units to shoot at in terms of are they within range, base to the closest point of the base to the closest point of the target's base, right? That's measuring to see if they're within range to shoot. Line of sight is actually measured from any point of the model to any part of the other model, right? So we're not measuring line of sight from here through here to his base. We're measuring line of sight to any part that we can see, which is the wingtip. So the Hive Tyrant can be shot because, although his model is behind the obscuring terrain, you can draw line of sight from these models to the wingtip without actually going through the terrain feature. Now, I don't have these guys perfectly positioned, but you kind of can get the idea of what I'm saying. And that's an important distinction, because as you have some models that have larger wingspans, or they have a larger, they take up a large footprint on the board, they can be obscured only if the line of sight would go through that terrain feature. Otherwise, they can technically be seen. So let's talk again here about the Hive Tyrant and his perspective, right? So we've identified the footprint. Let's say we've identified the footprint of this terrain feature as being basically the entire perimeter of the wall, right? So this squad here is hidden. They're not touching the terrain feature, and they're behind it, right? Right. Let's say they're right there where they would be hiding. And the Hive Tyrant flies up, and let's say he lands right here. Okay. Well, he can't see them because it's going through obscuring terrain. But if we've identified the footprint of this to be the outside wall all along the edge here, and the base, makes up the entire footprint of the piece. Well, this Hive Tyrant, if he ends his movement, say right here, touching the wall, right? His base is touching the wall now. Technically, he is within the terrain feature. And now he can shoot through this obscuring terrain feature so long as he can actually draw a normal line of sight. And he is also not benefiting from this terrain feature for obscuring. So, because he is technically within the terrain. So, in this point, right now, the Hive Tyrant is touching against the wall that has windows. So he is within the terrain feature's footprint. And thus, he can see through the windows and he can target this unit now, because he is within the terrain feature. And this unit here can target him back even without moving into the footprint, because he's technically within the terrain. So he's not benefiting from the obscuring benefit here, no matter what. Because he's touching the terrain, he's within it. So these guys could stand here, right where they are, and shoot him. And the Hive Tyrant can shoot them, because he's touching the wall, looking through, and drawing line of sight. Okay, those types of things are pretty important in terms of how the gameplay mechanics work, and how the terrain features work. So the next thing I want to talk about with these features is the scalable rule, which is a common thing that we see with a lot of our terrain features. And what scalable means is that infantry models and beasts and units that can fly can move up into the upper levels of an area terrain feature. Now, a lot of people look at this rule and kind of misconstrue it to mean, well, scalable is what allows my models to move up and down terrain features. That's not exactly correct. Scalable doesn't allow models to move up and down terrain features, because models have the ability to move up and down terrain features so long as their movement doesn't prohibit it or some other thing prohibits it. And what prohibits it in that case is scalable. So we see the Hive Tyrant, he has fly. So he can fly up and land up on this level of ruins right here, because he has fly. So this terrain feature has scalable, but he can get up there. Now let's say he was a monster that didn't have fly. Well, scalable allows infantry, swarms, and beasts and models with fly to get up on these upper levels of ruins. So these guys here are infantry, right? So they can get up there. Okay. But we're going to say that this Hive Tyrant here doesn't have wings. He's just a monster. And he can't actually get up there. Not because the rules of moving through terrain prohibit it, or moving in terrain prohibit it necessarily, but because the scalable rule prohibits it. He can't get up here because scalable says he can't, unless he can fly, because he's not an infantry, he's not a swarm, he's not a beast. The only way he would be able to get up there would be if he could fly, which we are simulating that he's just a regular Hive Tyrant. He doesn't have wings. So he can't actually get up here. He can't finish his movement up on top of this, and he can't move up and through these features because of that. But let's say this same guy was on an armored container, right? This armored container, it has scalable also, right? So he couldn't do it here either. And typically, with our containers and crates and things that we use, we also use scalable. And what that does is it prevents them from getting up there. But if this set of containers did not have the scalable keyword, then he could technically move up and over this thing if he didn't have fly, even though he's a monster, right? Now, we in our terrain features that we use, we also give these crates and containers scalable, which means that if he didn't have wings, he couldn't get up here. But he does have wings, so he can land here. He can finish his move on top of it. And of course, we know that when a model with fly moves, it ignores the vertical height distance. So let's say he's back here, right, and he has a 12-inch move, right? We can see that we can move him. Oh, let's see here. Oh. And this will give us our measurement. So he has a 12-inch move. We ignore the height distance, right? We ignore the height distance, so he can move 10 inches, say, to there, and he can land on top of it. So within his movement characteristic, he can land on top of it because it's scalable and he can fly. If he couldn't fly, he would have to actually maneuver around this thing. But he does, so he can land on top of it. Okay. So most of our terrain features that are meant for things to climb up and over have scalable. But I think there's the conception is, the perception is that scalable is what actually allows models to climb up and into terrain, and it actually prohibits what can climb up and into terrain. Okay, it's not a thing that grants a permission. Rather, it's something that grants that lays out a restriction to that movement. Okay, that's what it does. Because if that container did not have scalable, and this guy didn't have fly, and he was right here, and he could just move up and over it with his movement, right? He'd have to account for going up, across the terrain, and down, which usually we say is 3 inches per, right? So 3, another 3, and then 3 down, that's 6, and then you have another, however, many more inches he would have on his movement without wings, right? But because it has scalable, if he didn't have fly, he wouldn't actually be able to do that. Because he can't move up and over onto the levels, because he can't go across it, because he can't get up there. He can't go through that terrain because he can't end his movement there. Now, what they well, actually, let me take that back. He could move over it. He just couldn't end his movement on top of it. So if he didn't have a movement sufficient to get up and over it, he could, like, let's say he had a 6-inch movement. He couldn't get up and over it because his movement would end up putting him on top of it, and he can't scale it. If he had enough movement to climb up and over it, he could without wings. I'm sorry, that was confusing. But he can't end his movement on top of it. So if his movement was, say, 6 inches, and it's 3 to the top and then 3 across, he doesn't have enough to get down, so he couldn't get up there if he didn't have wings. The other thing is, we'll go back, which we'll get back to that later. We're going to go over breachable. Okay, so breachable is what allows units to move through terrain features. And it's specific to infantry, swarms, and beasts. That they can actually move through walls. Right, so when they're accounting for their movement, we know a Marine moves 6 inches. They don't actually have to go around the terrain here because this wall is breachable. So they can just move through it as long as they have enough movement to clear it. Right? So like this guy here, move 6 inches. He can get on the other side of that wall and move through the wall because it's breachable. But this monster cannot move through the wall. Not without flying over it, of course. So he couldn't technically move through it. Now he ignores the terrain for movement because he has fly, but let's say he didn't have wings, he could not move through that ruin. He would have to go around it. All right, same for like a dreadnought. Right, a dreadnought would have to move like let's say we have a Leviathan dreadnought here, right? Oh, what happened here? Oh, looks like we got a little too many Leviathans, that's scary. We don't want that. Alright, so let's say that this is a Leviathan Dreadnought, right? A model that doesn't have fly. He can't move through the ruin because he's not an infantry swarm of beasts. He doesn't have fly, so he can't just fly and jump over it. So his movement is limited to moving around the terrain. However, he could move into the bottom level if he can fit in there and touch it, which is important. So let's say we have this Leviathan Dreadnought here. Okay, this is going back to the obscuring rule. He's sitting right here. He's behind this wall. All right, he has less than 18 wounds, so he can he can just kind of chill here, right? All right. Now he can move into the bottom level, provided he has sufficient enough movement and height to actually fit there, right? So while he's sitting back here, he can be protected from obscuring, and he's also can't see to shoot unless it's something like Magnus over there or a knight from where his position is. But he could move up into the bottom level. Now he can look through the ruins because he can fit there, and he can't get up on top because he can't scale it because he's not an infantry beast or swarm. He doesn't have fly, but he can get to the bottom level here if he fits and stand there, and now he can shoot out of these windows. And conversely, he can be targeted. Let's say these Marines here were on the other side, right? Even though they would be firing and it would go through obscuring terrain, because he's inside this obscuring terrain and there's windows there, he could be seen and shot. So he could go into the first level as long as he could fit, of course, and stand there, even toe in. He wouldn't have to go in all the way, right? Let's just say he's touching right there. He's just touching the edge. He's toe in. He can shoot out of it normally through those windows, whatever he can see. And because he's toe in and touching it, he can also be shot, right? Same applies for him if he's on the other side, like the Hive Tyrant was earlier, right? And he walks up to this ruin on the outside, because we've defined that this ruin's footprint is all the entire edge and the base. He can just move up to this wall and touch it, and now you can see through there to shoot. Okay, so that's kind of important in how those interactions work. So let's talk about containers here. And this is a good opportunity to kind of switch and move over, because we've gone over the obscuring, right, and how that functions. Let's talk about containers, because containers are obstacles. And obstacles, what they do is they give a terrain, or they give a benefit for things for certain types of units within 3 inches of them. Infantry, beasts, and swarm models receive the benefits of cover while within 3 inches of the feature, unless a straight line can be drawn from the attacker to all parts of the target model without it passing over or through this terrain feature. Okay. So what that means is, let's take a look here, and let me see if I can kind of get this set up. Let's say we've got this Leviathan and he's standing right there, right? Okay, let's get him to where you can actually see something. Okay, let's zoom in here. I'll turn him around. Alrighty, this Leviathan's standing right here. He wants to shoot at these Marines right here. Well, he can see this guy, right? But he cannot draw a straight line to all parts of the model without it going through the container, right? So these guys are within 3 inches of the container, and even though he can be seen, he's receiving the benefit of cover, of light cover, because that's what we say that this container has. right? It has, well, this one says scalable exposed position, but generally speaking on ours, the containers in our, when we play, have light cover, scalable, and exposed position. Okay. So the Leviathan cannot draw a line of sight to the model without passing through the terrain feature partially. So this unit is receiving the benefit of cover. And if this guy's standing out in the open, now they're not. Because now the Leviathan can draw line of sight to the model without passing through it, and can see all parts of the target model. So this model is not receiving the benefit of cover, but these other guys back here are. Right? So if he starts shooting and wounding and this guy has to make a save, he's not going to get a benefit of light cover. But these guys back here will, because they are partially blocked. Now he can't see them, right? But you only need to see one model in a unit to target it. Right? So this guy wouldn't benefit from the cover save. We'd shoot him, we'd start taking saves on him first, he'd die. Then the rest of the saves would have a light cover attached to them. A light cover save. Unless they are on top of it. If they're on top of the container, because the way we play the obstacles, and even the way that most people play them, is that they have exposed position. Which means that although this terrain feature normally gives light cover out, it only gives it to infantry, swarms, and beasts if they're partially blocked, and the attacking model can't see an entire model there. But when they're on top here, they have exposed position, which means they receive no benefit of cover from the obstacle at all. They're standing up there on top of it. And that model doesn't. These models don't receive any benefit of cover. They don't get the light cover save. They're just out in the open. They can be shot, seen normally, and they receive no benefit of cover. So let's look at something like. I'm trying to find one that will kind of simulate one that we use here a lot, like the building type. I guess we can use this one over here on the end here, right? We have these certain enclosed buildings that we use at the shop, and they're basically 4 walls and a roof, maybe another thing on top of it. Same thing, 4 walls and a roof. They're enclosed. There's no windows. There's no anything. They're just enclosed buildings. The way we play those is area terrain features, and they have obscuring and light cover and scalable. But they do not have breachable, which means that no model can enter inside of them. So models can't actually go inside of those buildings and sit there. They can go on top of them, but they can't go in them. So they can only go up onto the upper levels. They cannot go through them. They have to actually move around them, because those buildings that we use don't have breachable. So they can't even move through it, as we explained here on the other side with the obscuring piece that's a ruin that has breachable. The infantry could just move right through it. And this terrain piece, because it's a building, doesn't have that, so they actually have to move around the terrain feature. They cannot move through it. So they couldn't move through the wall, even to end their movement on the other side of it. They could clear it, because this doesn't have breachable. It has scalable, which means they could go up to the upper level, but they can't go in it. These, again, are those enclosed buildings that we use at the shop. So these terrain features are pretty important to note. I want to also talk about dense cover, because dense cover is one of those interesting rules, because it provides a it provides a negative modifier to hit when you're inside, or when your line of sight goes through it. So let's talk about dense cover. And one of the typical things that we use with dense cover is ruins that are less than 5 inches high. So if a ruin is less than 5 inches tall, we have some of those at the store and that we play on. Those don't provide obscuring. They can still naturally block line of sight potentially, depending on what's behind them or what can actually be seen. But they all have dense cover. If it's less than 5 inches, that's how we play it. So we also do that for forests, right? All our woods that we use have dense cover. So we're going to simulate here what this means. So let's say we have this squad of Marines, and this Leviathan's on the other side of the woods. Okay. Now, dense cover says if this terrain features at least 3 inches in height, then subtract 1 from the hit roll when resolving an attack with a ranged weapon, unless you can draw straight lines 1 millimeter in thickness to every part of at least 1 model's base or hull. Okay. So we can't do that. We can't draw a line that goes through to any part of an entire model here, because it says unless you can draw straight lines 1 millimeter in thickness to every part of at least 1 model's base or hull. Every part. So let's say this guy was like on the corner here, right? He's right on the corner. So let's say he's like right here. Right, so the Leviathan could draw, say, a line of sight from there to there, right? But he could, let's say he couldn't draw it from here to there without it going through the terrain. So let's say he's more like this, right? So you could draw a line from here to here without going through the feature, but you can't draw it to every part of its base, right? Because at some point you're going to go through the terrain, because it has to go through the line must be able to reach every part of the model's base or hull without passing through the terrain. And it can't. So they would be -1 to hit shooting through there. Now, of course, you don't suffer that -1 to hit if you're targeting an aircraft model, or if which usually have -1 to hit anyway, or if you're targeting a model with a wounds characteristic of 18 or more, even if the terrain feature is between it and the firing model. But the reverse is not true. So let's say that that instead of a Leviathan standing there behind that dense cover, we have a knight standing here, right? We got a knight standing here. Well, he has more than 18 wounds. So these guys here, the multi-meltas, can actually shoot the knight without suffering dense cover penalty, because it's a model that has more than 18 wounds. But if the knight tries to target them, he doesn't get that benefit from this position, right? So if you're, the other thing to this is that if you're actually in the terrain, on or in the terrain feature, then you don't suffer the penalty. If the only terrain feature that it passes through that gives dense cover is the one you're in. So let's say the knight was toe in here, right? Now he's touching the terrain feature, so he doesn't have, if the line that he's shooting from now he passes through that terrain feature, even though this terrain feature has dense cover and it does pass through it, because he's toe in and touching it, then he doesn't suffer the penalty to hit. And it's important that we distinguish within and wholly within. Wholly within means the entire model would have to be on the terrain feature, or there, within the terrain feature, every part of it to be able to get it. Every model in the unit would have to be, right? But this doesn't require wholly within, it's just within. So within is touching. So he's right there on the edge. He's touching the dense cover terrain piece. So anything that he targets on the other side of this forest, he will not suffer -1 to hit from shooting through this forest here. Now, if there was another feature here, let's say there was another forest right here that had dense cover, and this squad was on the other side of it, he wouldn't suffer the -1 because of shooting through here, but he might from shooting through another one. And typically you're not going to see that very often, but it's possible that you could. So that's dense cover in a nutshell. Of course, difficult ground, forests and craters have those, which is -2 to movements and charge unless you fly, which is pretty self-explanatory. Typically, woods don't offer light cover. They just offer difficult ground and dense cover, which means that if these guys are inside of this, let's see, we have the Marines here, they're inside of this forest, they will not benefit from a cover save of light cover. They won't get +1 to their saves, but they would benefit from dense cover if something outside of it was trying to shoot into them. So let's say this knight is standing right here, and these guys are all in it, in the dense cover, and he tries to shoot them. He can't make contact from his base to every part of a model's base that's not without passing through dense cover, so they're all -1 to hit. But they don't suffer a -1 shooting through there because they're touching the terrain. Now, if the knight moved up here, was also in the dense cover with them, then he would not suffer the penalty to hit them, because he's also touching it. So he could shoot them without suffering dense cover penalty because he's touching it as well. These guys would have -2 to their movement, so normally a Marine would move 6 inches. So if any part of their model or any part of their base moves through a piece, then they have to subtract 2 from their movement. So let's say this squad is here, and they want to get to this point here. They would, if they didn't want to suffer the penalty to their movement, they would have to move around, right, to get to there. And if any part of them had to go through the feature, they could then have to subtract 2 from their movement, so their movement would be 4. They'd have to stop right there. They couldn't move through it unless they had fly, or some kind of special rule that ignores it, which not many models have, but some do. I think that's probably going to cover it mostly. One thing that we don't typically use is heavy cover. We just don't use that rule a lot. Most tournaments and stuff don't use heavy cover because it's a little bit too game shifting, and that's if a unit is in a terrain feature that has heavy cover, then they get +1 to their saving throw, not their invuln save, but their armor saving throw, while they're in there in combat, unless they charged into it that turn. But if they're standing there and something charges them, they get +1 to their save. We just don't usually use heavy cover just because it's super powerful, especially if you have something like Blade Guard or Terminators in a ruin with heavy cover. It's really it can be really game shifting. So a lot of people don't use it. The other thing I want to talk about is defensible. Like we see this ruin here has defensible, and a lot of the ruins that we use have that keyword, and it's not used very often. And the reason for that is because to gain the benefit of it, every model has to be within the terrain feature. So let's say this one has defensible, so it's if every model in here was touching it, right? And say this Flyrant wanted to charge them, right? Say the Flyrant was right here and he wanted to charge them. They're all touching the terrain feature. They would have defensible, so they could either hold steady or set to defend. And if they hold steady, they could overwatch him and on 5s and 6s instead of just 6s. And if they set to defend, they could add 1 to their hit rolls in the subsequent fight phase instead of using the 5-up, 5 or better overwatch. So like if the Hive Tyrant's right here and he wants to charge these guys, they're all touching the terrain. They could spend 1 CP for fire overwatch, and then they would hit the Hive Tyrant on 5s instead of just 6s. Or they could say we're going to set to defend, and we'll add 1 to our hit rolls in the fight phase. Now, let's say you have five guys in the squad, but only 4 are touching the terrain piece, then they cannot benefit from defensible. Every model in the unit has to be touching it. And that's specific to infantry. And that's another thing that's really important. That is specific to infantry. Every model in an infantry unit is on or in an area terrain feature with this trait, then it can hold steady or can set to defend when an enemy unit declares a charge against it. Hold steady when you do overwatch attacks, they hit on 5. If you set to defend, you don't fire overwatch, but you add 1 to the hit rolls when resolving the attack. So they couldn't fire overwatch at all. They just add 1 to their hit rolls. It's a good rule. It's a nice, nifty little rule, but it's not. It doesn't come up very often in our games, typically because most of the time, these types of units are going to be on the other side, not touching the terrain, because they're trying to benefit from the obscuring part of it. That is not to get shot, so they won't usually be in there, but that is a thing that could happen. So I hope that this kind of cleared things up, and I hope that really gives some insight, some benefits onto terrain and how it's used, and what you can do with it, and what its function is in the games. And maybe that can offer a little bit of clarity into how they operate, and how the terrain rules function and what they do, and to give you a better, more clear understanding of how they function in your games. The terrain rules in 9th edition are very good. They're very interactive, and they do a lot of different things in the game, which is great. And knowing and understanding how the terrain functions will help you be able to understand what to do and how to use terrain in your games to benefit you. Now, I will say, I will say that we've been playing with these terrain rules for a while now, but I know not everybody's clear on them. But the most important thing to do is, if you go to an event, oftentimes the TO will have defined these traits. Like in our league pack, it's defined, right? All these types of terrains that we have in our meta all have terrain features, and they're all pretty well known by our guys now. But you might go to an event where those aren't defined up front, and you need to understand and define those features with your opponent before you guys start playing. So if you're at an event, the TO said you guys determine what the terrain's going to be, then you guys you and your opponent need to understand, first of all, what the footprints and what the boundaries are of those terrain pieces, what the traits are going to be of them, and don't take it for granted, because some people won't take it for granted. We take it for granted that, yeah, all ruins will be scalable and breachable. But if you don't clarify that with your opponent, they might be playing a different game. And you might be under the understanding that, oh, that's an obscuring ruin, I can move through it because it's a ruin. But your opponent says, well, we didn't say they were breachable. We didn't agree to that. And now you've got a conflict at the table that could have been avoided in a pregame discussion. Generally not going to happen a lot, but just something to think about when you go to an event. always make sure that the rules for the terrain are clear between you and your opponent, so that you both know that what the terrain does, how it functions, and what its traits are, so that you're both playing the same game. But that's all I got. I think that's pretty in depth, so I'll let it go now. And if you guys have any questions, we're gonna do some more workshops. And I think using TTS and making these videos is a kind of a good way to do that. And will give me the opportunity to kind of even go into some of the more finite details later on, such as movement, positioning, screening, things like that. But I wanted to get the terrain one out of the way first, because I know that's a high demand one, and there's a lot of interest in kind of a breakdown on how terrain functions and what it does. I hope it was helpful. I'm sorry if it was long-winded, but there's a lot to cover and a lot of different interactions to review. So I'm going to call it on this one, and let me know what you guys think.